Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to another Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, now known as the Dan Schnur Political Report, that Dan produces every month. We are, in addition to our live streams, we're starting to produce in-person programming. So if you have a second at the end of today's program, please check out our website at LAWACTH and see what's coming down the pike. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, as usual, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of our screen where you can type in your questions, and our Claire Krelitz, who is our communications manager and digital producer, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion, which will start in about 30 minutes. So it's my great pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur.
Hello, Kim.
We are just so eager to have you dive into tonight's topic, which let me read that off, and then I'm going to turn this over to you because we need every second with you. How much longer will the war in Ukraine last, and how to plan for what comes after? Please take it away, Dan.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. And as I hope you know, I don't pretend to have an answer to either of those questions, but we'll certainly explore them over the next hour, first with me offering you some thoughts, and then, as always, when Claire Krelitz joins me, and we answer as many of your questions as possible. But as always, I'm very grateful to all of you for joining us here. When we shifted to this monthly format, part of our thinking was that we'd be able to take a broader look at the most important issues that we're facing as a country and as a planet, and that maybe we wouldn't need to spend as much time on the day-to-day breaking news that ended up driving a lot of the conversations we'd be having when we met every Tuesday for the first couple of years of this webinar. But the challenge with doing one of these programs during a war is that the news changes so quickly on a daily, even an hourly basis. It makes it very difficult to talk about these broader challenges outside the context of immediate breaking news, because that breaking news so frequently and so dramatically changes the broader landscape. So when we began planning today's program a week or so ago, I had imagined talking about Joe Biden's very provocative soundbite about Vladimir Putin when he said, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power," and about Biden's references to Putin as a butcher and as a war criminal. That was last week. Then, since then, we've seen the horrific photos from Bucha and from other ravaged small towns and suburbs outside of Kiev that demonstrated the scope of the atrocities committed by Russian troops during the time they occupied those regions of Ukraine over the last several weeks. So now Biden's language from a couple weeks ago seems almost measured compared to what others are now saying. And the speeches that Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky delivered to Congress and to the British Parliament and to other Western leaders over the last month, those speeches have seemed almost subdued compared to the message that Zelensky delivered to the UN General Assembly earlier today. And for those of you who haven't seen the news of the last few hours yet, Zelensky essentially told the United Nations delegates that they either needed to stand up to Russia more forcefully, in particular to expel Russia from the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, or the UN should simply dissolve itself altogether for abandoning its principles. So before we go any further, Rachel, if you can help me with our first question for our group. So far, now that we're a bit more than a month in, how would you rate President Zelensky's handling of the crisis? Would you give him a grade of excellent, of good, of fair, or of poor, knowing that the last time we gathered, the war was barely a week or so old. And here we are a month later. I think about how much we've learned since then, not just about Zelensky and about Ukraine, but on a much broader scale. So Rachel, what does our audience think about Zelensky? How do they rate his performance so far? Look at that. Wow. 86% of our respondents give Zelensky a grade of excellent. 13% say good, and not a single respondent rates him either fair or poor. Now, I talked a minute ago about the challenges of doing this once a month during wartime. But one of the advantages of getting together on a monthly basis rather than every week is that we can look at the topics with a broader and a more long-term perspective. So you look at those numbers on Zelensky, but it's worth remembering that when the war started, he was viewed as a former television comedian who was over his head. Zelensky, when the war broke out, had a 30% approval rating with the Ukrainian people. And if you remember, many Western observers doubted he'd even stay in the country in the face of a Russian invasion. We remembered the way Afghanistan's leaders had fled their country last summer when the Taliban reached Kabul. And recognizing the tremendous military advantage that Russia had over Ukraine, it seemed very plausible that Ukraine would fall very quickly in the same way. And it's fashionable to criticize Putin now for underestimating the Ukrainian resistance. But to be fair, he wasn't the only one. Now, so the world has changed for Zelensky in all sorts of ways. But the world's also changed for Joe Biden since the war broke out. 2 months ago, the global perception was that Afghanistan had cost Biden the ability to rebuild the United States' relationships with our allies, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere in the world, and that Biden was struggling to regain this country, our country's place on the world stage. That was just 2 months ago. But since the war broke out, NATO, of course, has held together very strongly, much as a result of Biden's work. And that's been very surprising to Putin and to many others, both East and West. Just as surprising to many of us as the way Ukraine has fought back. So on the other hand, well, I'd say this, on one hand, Biden has fashioned and strengthened this alliance in a way that we haven't seen in quite some time. On the flip side, though, American voters have really only given Biden fairly lukewarm ratings on how they feel he's handled the war. And large majorities of the American public say that they'd rather he was spending more time and more attention on the economy and on inflation and on other domestic policy issues than on Ukraine. So, Rachel, if we can, let's put up our second question. We got a sense of what our group thinks of the way Zelensky's handled the war. What do all of you think about the way Biden has handled the crisis? Would you give our president a grade of excellent, of good, of fair, or of poor? And what we can do once we've gotten those results is compare them with what you all said about Zelensky just a minute or two ago. So Rachel, how do we do? What does our group have to say about President Biden's handling of this? Those are markedly different numbers. 30% excellent compared to 86% excellent for Zelensky. 55% give him a good rating, and 14% give him a fair or a poor. So that's a more than 50-point differential between our group's ratings of the two presidents on the scale of excellent, and that 14% for fair or poor for Biden, remember, contrasts with the 0% of our group that gave similar ratings to Zelensky. Now, to be fair to President Biden, this challenge is a difficult one. His country is not at war. And Zelensky, like many leaders in the past in many countries, has certainly benefited from the rally round a flag effect that comes when a country is at war, particularly when that country is attacked. And of course, our country has not been. For Biden, on the other hand, while he has assembled this coalition and held it together, and while he's also called out Putin in very strong terms, and while he's also provided considerable amounts of aid and sanctions and military assistance to Ukraine, Zelensky is asking for more. So on one hand, Biden is doing a great deal diplomatically, economically, militarily. But Zelensky, who, as we saw in our own poll numbers, whose stature here in the United States and around the world has just soared, understandably, is asking for an even larger commitment from the US and from NATO, because he wants his country to survive. And the challenge then for Biden is that as much as he is doing and encouraging our European allies to do, given that he's not meeting all of Zelensky's requests, the result is that Biden seems somewhat hesitant to commit fully to the war effort. Now, again, to be fair to Biden, Biden has made it clear that he wants to avoid turning this conflict into World War III, and that Biden recognizes that direct military conflict with Russian troops of any kind could very quickly spiral out of control. So he hasn't provided all the weapons that Zelensky's requested. And what that does is it leaves Biden stuck in a less than ideal for him halfway point, where he talks about the need to push back hard against Putin in every way possible, but maybe not every way possible. And if you talk about someone as a butcher and as a war criminal, then the question is, why would you not want to do everything to remove him? And even while Biden does explain his concerns about broadening and worsening the conflict, it does create some sort of an internal disconnect in the eyes of media audiences, both in the US and worldwide. So to me, that is a logical one of the explanations as to why Biden's numbers aren't as strong as Zelensky. The other, of course, particularly for us in the US, is we're only judging Zelensky by one standard. How effectively is he rallying his people against Russia? We're still judging Biden by many standards, many international and domestic policy matters, and it's obviously a lot more complicated. But to this question about the halfway point in which Biden finds himself, wanting to push back hard against Putin, but on the other hand, not wanting to do everything that Zelensky's asking for. Rachel, let's put up another question for our group and see what they think about that balance. So given the challenge that I just described, how do you think he should be handling it? And I asked you this a month ago, and so I'm going to be eager to see if your opinions have changed. Do you think that Biden should be more aggressive toward Russia? Do you believe that he should be less aggressive toward Russia? Or do you think he has it about right? And let's see now which of those alternatives, Rachel, our group is provided for us. Interesting, very interesting. And that is a change from last month. We are now seeing a 52% cohort saying that Biden should be more aggressive toward Russia. That's significantly higher than it was a month ago. Only 1% are saying less aggressive, and we weren't hearing much more than that for our March program. 47% say he has it about right. I'll remind you, when we polled on this at the beginning of March, a much greater percentage of our group said Biden has it about right. And obviously the question for us to consider is Biden being less aggressive, or have our expectations heightened? And I think it's more the latter than the former. But of course, and we have the advantage of taking this survey after we've just witnessed these horrible scenes out of Bucha and heard other stories of Russian soldiers slaughtering civilians, which has raised the stakes considerably for both Biden and Zelensky. Now, both of them have been urging Russia to negotiate toward peace. But many of their supporters, especially Zelensky's, after seeing these scenes from Bucha, after hearing the horrible stories about these massacres, many of Zelensky's supporters might not be in any mood to negotiate, and certainly not be in any mood to compromise with a country and a leader who've committed such horrible war crimes. So over the last several weeks, Zelensky has done a very effective job of rallying his people against the Russian menace. But on the other hand, he also has to figure out a way to negotiate with them. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. And one of the many complicated challenges that Zelensky faces is how does he negotiate out an end to this war without the Ukrainian people feeling like they have been abandoned by the leader who they've pledged to follow. So let's take another step back and let's think about and let's talk about where things can go from here. Because these days, the question most frequently asked in Washington and in Russia and, well, everywhere is how does this end? And no one has a good answer, or much of an answer at all. The negotiations last week seemed to produce something that many people, many observers, especially in the West, were very eager to grab onto and cling to as a ray of hope. And that sign of encouragement came when the Russians announced late last week that their troops would be withdrawing from the areas around Kiev. And in response to that announcement, the Ukrainian negotiators suggested that perhaps neutrality for their country between East and West was possible, and that they would give up their dream of joining NATO, and even suggested putting aside a discussion about the status of Crimea for another 15 years. So both sides seemed pretty willing to give. And like I said, it did seem like a hopeful sign, but almost immediately after the Russians announced that they were going to withdraw from Kiev, the Biden administration was very quick to tamp down expectations. Secretary of State Blinken said, and I quote, "There is what Russia says and there is what Russia does," unquote. And it was the right warning from Blinken, and Biden has given it also, because the Russian government really hasn't kept its word since the beginning of this conflict. Remember that Russian officials claimed for most of the winter that they had no intention of invading Ukraine. Remember Putin's declaration that all those thousands of troops would be returning to their bases from the Ukrainian border in mid-February when their exercises were over. And 9 days later, that's when the invasion began. And sure enough, just as Blinken predicted, a few days after Russia announced that it was withdrawing from Kiev, it became very clear that the Russian army wasn't withdrawing, but was rather regrouping. And by shifting their emphasis to the eastern part of the country, to the Donbas region, their withdrawal from the area outside of Kiev allowed us to see the atrocities that have taken place there. And where we now stand is a situation where Russia seems to be digging in, if anything, intensifying its fight for the eastern region of the country, while the Ukrainians secure their hold over Kiev and some of the other cities that might have been in other parts of the country that might have been more contested early on. And so the question that leaves us, or that we leave this section with, is that as Russia retrenches in the east, seemingly having scaled back its goals, and as Ukraine's position is much more secure than it was a month ago, the question, of course, is what comes next. And I'll offer my own thoughts, but first I want to hear, Rachel, if we can put up the next question, I'd like to hear what you think comes next. So the question for you, and this is perhaps the most important question for us to consider, is what do you think will be the ultimate outcome of this war? Do you think the outcome will be a Ukrainian victory with a full Russian withdrawal from Ukraine? Do you think there'll be a victory for Russia, in which Zelensky and the Ukrainian government is replaced, which, if you remember, was Putin's originally stated goal? Or third, do you think there will be some kind of compromise, some type of middle ground, in which Russia holds on to eastern Ukraine, onto the Donbas region, and Ukraine is able to maintain control of not all, but the majority of their existing country? What do you think comes from? What do you think will ultimately come from all this? Well, What do we got, Rachel? What does our group think? Oh, very interesting. Look at those results. 81% think that there's going to be a compromise. 16%, which is greater than a month ago, believe a full Ukrainian victory can be achieved, in which Russia leaves the country altogether. And there are some Western observers who believe that that can happen if Biden and NATO were to commit more military support for Ukraine. But of course, that does run the risk of a much greater and broader outbreak. And only 3% see a Russian victory in which Zelensky and his government are replaced. And that's a much smaller number than most thought a month ago. Now, I agree with you. An absolute victory for either side looks very difficult right now. But there's not much incentive right now for either side to compromise. Russia's doubling down on the eastern part of the country. Ukraine has realized some great victories in other parts of their nation. And generally speaking, in warfare, a nation only looks to compromise when they think they're losing. And right now, neither Russia or Ukraine thinks they're losing, at least not enough to compromise. We should also put this in a little bit of time perspective. I mean, it's been a very bloody and a very traumatic 5 or 6 weeks, but it's only been 5 or 6 weeks. And in the history of warfare, that's really actually a very, very short time period. Again, both sides clearly think they can win, and that's not a great mindset for compromise. And the question of what winning would look like, given the likelihood of an absolute victory being so slim, the question of what victory would even look like is a very sticky issue. And that's what's being agonized over in Washington and Kiev and Moscow. So on the Ukrainian side, and I mentioned this earlier, there's concern that Zelensky's just not going to be able to offer the Russians what they want, say that the eastern Donbas and Crimea in exchange for an end of the war, because there is so much anger, understandably, among his people and so much distrust toward Russia, that kind of a deal could actually get Zelensky run out of power by his own people. Because of the successes they've achieved, Ukrainians now want total victory, which means in their minds driving all Russian forces from every square inch of Ukrainian territory, including the Donbas and Crimea, and offering the regions up as part of a deal only 5 weeks into a war where the Ukrainian army seems to have seized the momentum would be political suicide for Zelensky. And of course, it wouldn't be a guarantee that Putin wouldn't decide that he wants more land after all and send his troops back in again in a few weeks, a month, or further down the line. Interestingly, though, there's a similar dynamic occurring on the Russian side. Now, the difference is that Russia doesn't have a political system where Putin faces any accountability. But it now seems that, like Zelensky, Putin has become a prisoner of his own success. He spent so much time early on in this war revving up his own base of support. And Putin's approval ratings have skyrocketed over the course of this war, given the very one-sided nature of news that Russian citizens are hearing about what's happening in Ukraine. And so last week, when news of compromise from the Russian negotiating delegation in Istanbul became public, it led to a huge outcry from Putin loyalists and the nationalistic wing in Russian society that Putin's been encouraging for many years. So both leaders have convinced their bases the total success, the total victory is possible, and they must fight to that no matter what. And now, given your own analysis about the most likely outcome, in very different ways, both Zelensky and Putin are going to have to find a way to tell those very motivated supporters of theirs that they might have to give up something more than they want to. Now, meanwhile, particularly in the aftermath of the pictures and the news we learned over the weekend about the Russian atrocities outside of Kiev, meanwhile, we're seeing the United States and NATO allies stiffening sanctions, sending additional military equipment and weapons, and raising the stakes in other ways that might make it harder for Putin to back down. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the wrong thing to do. In the face of those kind of war crimes, of course you want to take stronger measures. But it is important to recognize that that kind of more assertive behavior changes the dynamic and might make it harder for Putin to back down if and when the time comes. So now the question is, how does either side back down? And part of the answer, at least, is not very quickly. Now, just to shift tacks for a few minutes before we open this up to your questions, and Claire joins me for us to go through them, it's worth remembering, as I know all of you do, that even though it's the most visible and the most urgent challenge that we're facing, Russia is still far from the only challenge that the US is facing on the world stage. And in different ways, China and Iran and North Korea have all taken advantage of the West's focus on Eastern Europe to begin to cause trouble on each of their own fronts. So before we dig a little bit deeper into those other challenges which are festering, another question for all of you, and I ask this one of you regularly, but I'll be interested in seeing if the results have changed. Rachel, can we put up, there we go. The next question, thank you, Rachel. What do you think is the biggest global challenge for the United States? And I know we ask this regularly, but it is interesting to track how your answers change and don't change. Given everything we've talked about, is Russia the US's biggest challenge? Is China? Is Iran potentially without a new nuclear agreement? Or is it North Korea, given their new ballistic missile, intercontinental ballistic missile tests? Or other? Is there another challenge that we didn't name here because we just didn't have the space? So what do all of you think? What is the biggest global challenge for the United States? And I should add, for our allies. Rachel, how do we do? Interesting. China is still far and away the top answer, but that margin is much less than it was a month ago. By roughly a 2-to-1 margin, our group says that China is the biggest challenge for the United States. But that was between a 3 and 4-to-1 margin when we polled on this exact question at the beginning of March. Iran and North Korea don't register much more than they did then, but it is interesting to watch how the numbers on Russia, not surprisingly, have risen over the last month of warfare. But most of you do still see China as our greatest challenge. And so therefore, it's worth keeping an eye on their behavior throughout this crisis. Because China's behavior over the last several weeks of war has been very instructive. Now, Chinese leaders are caught between two competing imperatives. On one hand, China declared just before the outset, just before the invasion, China declared a very strong relationship with Russia. And it's very clear, as the hostilities have broken out, that China does not want a unified West that might somehow get in the way of a potential move that they would make in the future against Taiwan. And as China has watched the way the West has come together on Ukraine's behalf, you know that that's giving them pause about how the West would react if an invasion of Taiwan were to take place. Just like many observers underestimated the ability of the West to coalesce behind Ukraine, I think China has anticipated in the past that it would be difficult to see that kind of collective effort on Taiwan's behalf. And now that's something they might be rethinking. On the other side, just like China doesn't want a unified West to move on Taiwan, and so therefore they have some interest and some incentive to support Russia, at least to some degree, in this conflict. On the other hand, China is dealing with profound, as all of you know, with profound demographic and economic challenges. And the last thing China needs right now is any kind of turmoil or disruption of its economic relationships around the world. So on one hand, China wants the West to face challenges with Russia, because the more that we're tied down there, perhaps the less attention we have for the Pacific Rim. On the other hand, as we saw last week when China's representatives met with the leaders of the European Union, China wanted to talk trade. The EU leaders wanted to talk Ukraine. And so already China is seeing this tremendous economic disruption that the war is causing them. On one hand, they want to help Russia and keep the West from getting too strong. On the other hand, they need the economic flow to continue. So they are in sort of a difficult situation, and watching China as this war goes forward is going to be critically important, not just for Russia's ability to sustain, but for how China might conduct itself in its part of the world once this war in Eastern Europe is over. Now, the United States, like most of you, of course, still sees China as a much greater threat. And we saw one example of that just today, that even while the fighting rages in Ukraine, today the Biden administration announced that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia are teaming up on the development of a new class of what's called hypersonic weapons. Now, those of you who follow this stuff closely know that hypersonic missiles are much more maneuverable in flight than most non-nuclear weapons. And that makes them much more difficult to detect on radar and to destroy with missile defense systems. Now, Russia has used this kind of hypersonic missile against Ukraine over the past couple weeks. But today's announcement isn't about developing these hypersonic missiles for war in Eastern Europe. Today's announcements are about countering China on the Pacific Rim. And the leaders of the three countries of the US, the UK, and Australia said today that they renewed commitment to this effort because of Russia's invasion and use of these missiles. But you may remember that this partnership was announced last September. Remember, it caused a huge dust-up in Europe, particularly with the French. And it started last fall as an effort to help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines and to develop advanced defense technologies. And that was motivated by China's hypersonic missile test last year, which caught US intelligence officials by surprise. So even while the fighting is raging in Eastern Europe, even while we're seeing photos and hearing news of atrocities, of mass murders, of massacres in Ukraine, the US government is still working with its allies to prepare for similar and perhaps even more difficult challenges on the Pacific Rim. So I'll go back to the point that I was making a moment ago. On one hand, China is looking at the West's reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with some pause and thinking, is that really the reaction we want if we invade Taiwan? On the other hand, they're thinking, if the West is distracted and paying so much attention to Ukraine and Russia, they're not paying as much attention to us. And so the question then becomes, and we'll conclude this section on, is by asking all of you, does the Ukraine-Russia war, make China more or less likely to attack Taiwan? Because if you believe, as the majority of you do and as the US government does, that China is a more pronounced threat to Western interests, in addition to the urgencies of the war in Ukraine, the question is what this does to China's mindset, which has become increasingly aggressive on the Pacific Rim in recent years, particularly toward its relationship with Taiwan. So do you think the war makes China more or less likely to attack Taiwan? More, less likely, or unchanged? And Rachel, let's see what the answer is that we got. Look at that. By a more than 2-to-1 margin, our group thinks that the West's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by a 2-to-1 margin, the West's response to the invasion makes China less likely to attack Taiwan. 48%, almost half of you say that. Only 21% say more likely. And once again, a month ago, public opinion polls showed something much different. Most of us then thought that the distraction of a war in Eastern Europe might make that attack on China's part more enticing. But as the West has held together, as Ukraine has continued to resist, it looks like opinion has changed. And more of us are thinking that the events in Ukraine might give China some considerable pause. So lots of other things we can talk about what happens after the war and what this means. We should talk about what it means in terms of US domestic politics, the midterm elections, Biden's own political fortunes, the very noticeable change in this administration's approach to climate change policy and other domestic issues. All sorts of things we could talk about here. But Claire, I don't know about you, but for the next 25 minutes, rather than me just continuing to talk on and on, I think it's time we brought everybody else into the conversation. What do you think?
Sounds great. And I will just say to our audience, you have smart questions every month that we do this, but tonight I am just blown away by the level of intelligence that I'm seeing in these questions. Each one coming in, I'm like, wow, that's a great question. That's a great question. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. And we'll start with a question about Russia's sort of propaganda. So combining two questions here, Dan. The first is, do you think that Russia will be able to keep the truth from their population in the long run? And then, if not, when might the Russian people find out about the truth of the war, and what would their reaction be?
Well, one of the most interesting things about this conflict, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, is that Vladimir Putin's approval ratings in Russia have skyrocketed over the last month. More than 80% of Russians now are supportive of his presidency. Now, you have to take any polls that are taken in an authoritarian state with somewhat of a grain of salt. But this is a market increase. And one of the things we see is a very noticeable divide. Younger Russians and Russians in urban centers are much more likely to be able to access information from other parts of the world. They're familiar with technology, and their access to that technology makes it much more likely that they're going to hear voices that Putin's government would prefer they didn't. And so, for example, a few weeks ago, when Arnold Schwarzenegger recorded a message to the people of Russia, it was very clear it was not going to be heard by the entire country. And in fact, Schwarzenegger said in his message, "I hope you share this information with your friends and neighbors," acknowledging that many people weren't going to hear it. But for older Russians, and for those in more outlying and rural areas, they're not hearing the rest of the story. And it's very unlikely that as long as Putin remains in power, which if anything, I would argue is probably more likely now than it was a few weeks ago, the majority of the Russian people are not going to hear the truth. Now, significant percentages will, and growing percentages will. But if Putin were to say, and I'm not making a prediction here, just using as an example, if Putin were to say in a few weeks to the people of Russia, "We have accomplished this glorious victory because we now control this tiny little sliver of the eastern Donbas region of Ukraine," that wouldn't be his wording, of course. But most of his constituents would believe him because they're not going to hear an alternative point of view. And so I think it's going to be many years before the Russian people have a full understanding of what's happened. The one thing that flies in the face of that, given Putin's control over the news media, are the economic realities on the ground. Because while the Western sanctions against Russia are not as severe as they could be, and this is something Zelensky's been complaining about, and this is something I believe the West is now strengthening as a result of the knowledge that became public over the weekend, even the sanctions that have been imposed are creating real economic hardship on the ground for the people of Russia. And these kind of food shortages are causing real discomfort. Now, once again, for older Russians who've gone through similar periods of deprivation earlier in their lives, this is nothing new. But for younger Russians who haven't experienced this before, it's a very strong sign to them that something is very wrong.
So this next person says, "I find it hard to believe that Putin himself doesn't have the capability of viewing Western news. Therefore, don't buy the theory that he's not getting accurate information from his advisors. What are your thoughts on this, what Putin's seeing and what information he may be absorbing?"
Well, even if Putin is watching Western news, and you're right, he probably is, although we have no way of knowing, it's more than likely that he believes and is told by his advisors that the Western news media is deliberately falsifying their reports in order to make the Western situation and Ukraine situation look much better than it is. So we don't know to what extent Putin is exposed to that news, but we do know that he has been hearing from his advisors that things are going much better than in fact they have been. And if he does tune into CNN from time to time, or if that's provided to him, I suspect that that contrary information is surrounded with so many warnings about, if you will, fake Western news, that Putin is just as likely to discount it, or much more likely to discount it than to take it seriously.
So this next person is asking about sanctions versus atrocities. So do you think that sanctions have any way of stopping the war crimes going on? And then as a follow-up, what are the chances that Russia or Putin would be prosecuted for the war crimes?
The sanctions may have a very strong effect, but they're very unlikely, at least history suggests, that sanctions very rarely lead to regime change. It means that the people of that country suffer. But as we're already seeing in public opinion polling in Russia, Putin is blaming that suffering on the West. And so it's not causing people to turn against him. We've seen a couple of his former allies among the ranks of the oligarchs speak out against him, but for the most part, they're keeping their own counsel. And so while the economic sanctions are important, because they will at some point force the Russian government to consider how long they can maintain this military offensive, just financially, not in terms of public relations and politics. Rarely in the past have the sanctions led to a regime change. And of course, someone cannot be tried for war crimes for the most part as long as they remain in office. And so it would require Putin to be forced from office at some point in order for any serious tribunal to take place. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's very unlikely.
So I know you asked our audience on how they have been viewing Biden and handling this crisis, but somebody in the audience wants to know, do you think that Biden has done a decent job handling the Ukraine war? And if so, why does the war not appear to have improved Biden's polls much?
Well, the second part of that question is much easier to answer than the first. And I suspect one of the reasons that Biden's poll numbers have not improved is because most American voters believe that he should be spending more time on domestic policy matters and less time on Ukraine. And I think this is a result of that sort of half measure I was talking about earlier. So Biden has made great efforts to explain to the American people why what's happening in Ukraine is wrong. But on the other hand, by not committing full force to the pushback against it, I think that unintentionally suggests to Americans that maybe it's not quite as critical or quite as important as Biden says it is. I sympathize with him. He wants to be as forceful as possible against Putin, but he also doesn't want to start World War III. And it does appear, my own opinion, is that there are more forceful measures that he and NATO could take, both military and economically, to heighten the discomfort level on Putin that would not necessarily provoke a wider war. But that's easy for me to say from here in the cheap seats, Claire. I can suggest, based on what I've read, that there are more aggressive steps Biden could take. I'm not the one who'd have to live with the consequences of those decisions if they did, in fact, provoke Putin to a greater degree. And knowing that Russia does have the world's largest nuclear arsenal, I think does have a very discouraging effect. What's going to be very interesting in the days going forward is, now that we know more about what's happened in Ukraine, the pressure on Biden and other Western leaders is going to increase by an immense amount. So think about it. At this time last week, we'd seen pictures of all sorts of carnage and horrible things. But most of that destruction was on the base was a result of missiles being dropped. And so while that's something that we found reprehensible, even though we're not justifying the damage they caused, to a lot of us it was thought of as collateral damage. Even if Russia was trying to hit military targets and hit some civilian targets as well, hospitals, schools, other horrible examples, perhaps it wasn't intentional. What we learned over the last few days is about atrocities that are much more intentional and much more personal and much more painful. And already, even today, you're seeing Biden and other NATO allies moving on to further rounds of sanctions. You even saw the nation of Germany, which has probably been the most resistant to an oil embargo on Russia, given Germany's dependence on Russian energy supplies. You even see Germany joining a boycott, a partial boycott of Russian natural gas. Now there's all sorts of other energy that they're still getting from Russia. It's worth noting that Russia has sold $20 billion worth of energy product to Western interests since the war began. And make no mistake, that is fueling the war effort. But as we learn about these killings, as we learn about these massacres, as we learn about these horrors, I think it's going to be much more difficult for Biden and the West to withstand the pressures to act more aggressively. But the flip side of that is the more aggressively they act, the harder it then becomes for Putin to stand down. So I would say Biden is doing about as well as a US president can under very difficult circumstances. But long before we gather for another webinar like this one, my guess is we'll have seen a heightened level of response from the US and from NATO, not just diplomatically and economically, but in terms of military supplies also.
Thank you. So now we have a cluster of questions about the potential for nuclear weapons. So I'll start with this question. How do you evaluate the possibility of Russia deploying tactical nuclear weapons? The US has no such weapons that would allow a proportional response. So what are your thoughts that Russia might do this?
I think it's very tempting for Russia to deploy tactical nuclear weapons. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with the terminology, this is a nuclear weapon that has an impact on a much smaller geographic area than more conventional nuclear weapons do. Now, while the US doesn't have the exact same type of weaponry that Russia does, the US does have the capacity, and our allies do have the capacities to respond in a quote unquote proportional manner. So even though it's not a precisely commiserate response, there are ways for the United States to respond with something short of a full-on nuclear attack. The temptation on Putin to use a more limited nuclear weapon is a very strong one. I think that's one of the reasons that has kept Biden from being as aggressive as he might have been under other circumstances. The New York Times and others have reported that the US's highest levels of national defense and security officials are meeting with their counterparts from their allied nations almost round the clock on attempting to ascertain intelligence on what the likelihood of that might be. But given the lack of human intelligence that the West has now in Putin's innermost circles, we really don't know what he's thinking and whether or how he might act, particularly if facing an absolute defeat. And it's one of the reasons there's going to be such pressure for a compromise that allows Putin, even to his own people, to claim some type of victory. If the Russian troops are forced completely from Ukraine, as the Ukrainian people and many others now want, then it might become more tempting for Putin to resort to that kind of weapons. Whereas if he can claim some type of victory, even a small amount of territory in eastern Ukraine, he might be less tempted to do so. But it's a very very real possibility. And the most difficult part about this from the West and from NATO's perspective is not knowing with any degree of certainty what level of counter-aggression might provoke that.
Well, that tees up the next sort of cluster of questions that I'll combine here, but kind of mixing some together. So I understand it's a tough balance for the US and the West to try and avoid provoking all-out nuclear war. But if the West is continually afraid of Putin and his nukes, does that not allow him to have free rein to do what he pleases in Ukraine and anywhere else? And would this then potentially embolden other dictators with nuclear capacity to do the same in the future?
And this gets back to the question about China that we were talking about at the end of the first section of the webinar tonight. And that really is the very confounding challenge, because there is no precedent in the annals of nuclear warfare about this kind of tactical, limited, proportional type of response. For those who study more conventional warfare, they can look back to past battles fought over the centuries, if not over the millennia. You can study Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and Machiavelli and Hannibal and come to lessons about military strategy and tactics. But there's no history on this. There's no precedent. And so we don't know, because this is something that we've never faced before. And what you see the West doing, well, but certainly with some flaws, certainly not perfectly, is deciding that military pushback coupled with profound economic discomfort is the most likely recipe for the opposition to stand down. They haven't achieved all of their goals, they've been defeated, but not overwhelmingly and decisively so. It's entirely possible that in a nuclear era, we'll never ever see a treaty like was signed on the battleship Missouri, because whoever's on the losing end of that war effort is going to need to maintain some face in order to avoid resorting to much more destructive weapons. And I wish I had a better answer, even better guidance, but the honest answer is we don't know. And decades, maybe generations from now, future historians will be studying this conflict as when they began to understand the thinking behind the use of tactical nuclear weapons and so-called proportional response. But right now, we don't have any guidance to look toward on that front. Not at all.
Yeah, it's a really tough and kind of scary thing to grapple with. But
I would say that, just real quick before we go on the less dour note, we might not have a lot of history as it relates to limited nuclear warfare, but we do have a lot of history to draw from when it comes to human psychology. And one of the things we do know about Vladimir Putin is he wants to restore Greater Russia. And what we know is he wants to be remembered in history as the man who restored Russia to its former glory. Now, the questioners you quote are absolutely right. That can't be permitted for all sorts of reasons, not only because of the destruction it would cause in Russia's sphere of influence, but the encouragement it would provide to other countries in other parts of the world. So the question then is, if you don't let him have his way, how do you give him just enough so he can save face with his own people and to say, look, we are a greater Russia now than we were in January of 2022, and have that be good enough? So the military pushback and the severe economic squeeze is a way, on one hand, hopefully, to harm him enough to not want to continue, but not harm him so much that he wants to resort to weapons of last resort.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving a little bit more on the domestic front, but why hasn't Trump's cozying up to Putin and delaying military aid to Ukraine hurt his standing with the conservative wing of the Republican Party more?
Well, in fact, I think it has. And while Trump is still the most influential voice in the Republican Party, it's pretty clear he's not as influential a voice as he was 6 months ago or 12 months ago. And we're seeing evidence of this around the country in Republican campaigns where the candidate he's supporting are struggling. In the state of Georgia, in the state of Alabama, in other parts of the country, candidates with Trump's support who a year or two ago would have used that support as tremendous political fuel for their own campaigns are still struggling. And I don't know that a lot of Trump's most loyal Trump loyalists are saying, I used to love him, but now he's wrong about Putin and Ukraine, so now I don't like him anymore. I don't think it's quite that overt. But we are seeing significant evidence that his hold over the party is not as strong as it once was. He said he is still the most powerful voice in the party, but there's no question that even those Republicans who would still like him to be president in 2024 do not necessarily agree with him on Putin and Ukraine. And again, we are seeing evidence in Republican primaries around the country that some of his loyal voters are moving away from him for other reasons. One quick thing on this, for those of you who have never attended such a thing, in Washington, D.C., they have this very, very formal white tie dinner every year called the Gridiron Dinner, where the absolute elites of Washington political and journalists and diplomatic circles get together. And at the Gridiron Dinner every year, they have a Republican and a Democrat leader who gives a talk and delivers comedy remarks. Now, every president for decades has gone to this at least once in their presidency, including Trump. But this year, the Republican speaker was the governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu. And Chris Sununu, in his speech, began to bestow huge compliments, very laudatory language on Donald Trump, on what a wonderful leader he had been. In the middle of it, keep in mind this is a comedy routine, in the middle of it, Sununu introduced himself, said, "Who am I kidding here? He's effing crazy." And even though he said it in a joke in the context of a comedy routine, a Republican governor who is known to have presidential ambitions, saying something like that about Donald Trump, and what Sununu said more specifically is he said, Trump, is not crazy enough to be committed to an institution, but he's crazy enough not to get out if he was already in one. Now, you don't say that kind of thing even as a joke, unless you, as a sitting governor, think that there's a path for you toward the Republican nomination to president by tapping into the growing number of Trump doubters within the party. Once again, Trump is still the most influential voice in the Republican Party, and by some margin. There has been some ebbing of that. And over the next 2 years, we'll see to what degree that ebbing that lessening of influence continues.
Okay, so I know we're almost out of time, but I have one final question that I want to get to that actually touches sort of upon what your All Sides column from this past week was. We'll link that in the chat, but I just want to remind everybody, because there's also been a handful of people asking for more Dan Schnur Political Report. And I know Dan's maxed out with his time, but he does write a weekly column on All Sides. Like I said, we'll link that in the chat where you can get some more of this kind of analysis. But the final question is, isn't the greatest global challenge climate change? And I read your column, so I think some of the points there might be interesting in answering this question.
Well, hopefully we can send it out. And for those of you who are interested in such a thing, my friend John Gable runs a website called www.allsides.com. And it publishes news and opinion from the left, center, and right. And as I hope you would guess by now, I am decidedly center in this. And what I wrote for this week's column is that Biden, in order to protect against the cutoff of Russian oil and energy, is devoting much more time and effort to shoring up Western energy sources. And a lot of his supporters, who, as our questioner did, prioritize climate change, are not happy to see Biden and many other Democratic leaders talking about suspending the gas tax, doing additional drilling, releasing oil from the national reserves, and that sort of thing. And they argue that, well, shouldn't we be using this as an opportunity to wean ourselves further from fossil fuels? I think what Biden and many of his allies would argue is climate change still is a seminal challenge. But before we can take on the future of the planet, we, Biden would say, we have to win this war. And we can't win this war if gasoline is unaffordable and oil is unavailable to US and to European users. So I believe I concluded the column, and someone will be able to read it and see if I got the quote exactly right. I concluded the column by saying, Biden wants to win the war and save the planet. But he's facing a lot of skepticism from people who don't think he should be doing it in that order. But without for a moment minimizing the impact of climate change, I think Biden and most of his allies have understood that they won't be able to maintain political support to fight for the planet's future unless they can provide reliable energy sources for now to win the war that we've been talking about for the last hour. We should also tell them about our video add-ons that we do.
Yeah, totally. So in addition to the monthly webinar, Dan and I do a short recording mid-month where we pick out a few of the questions we didn't have time to answer. So if you didn't have your question answered today, there's a chance that we'll pick that to answer, and then we send that out about halfway through the month. So it's another opportunity to get some of this political content and also follow up on the questions that we didn't have answered. So.
And I don't know about you, Claire, but it's really fun for me because we don't get to as many questions as we'd like. And so by being able to answer a few more, even if it's not in real time, sending out a recording to all of our participants, sending out a recording of both the questions and the responses is a nice way to keep this conversation until we get together again next month.
Exactly. And that's what we call it, continuing the conversation. So I will see you in about a week, Dan, to do that. And we'll see you all here next month. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. Okay.
Dan, this was terrific as always. You give us clear heads and calm our hearts and our minds. So thank you for the monthly dose of intelligence and great guidance.
Well, as always, you know how much I enjoy it, and it means a lot to me that so many of you join us every month for these conversations. So we hope you'll keep coming back.
And for those of you who aren't members yet, there's another member benefit to spend some time with Dan, which we're going to do right after this program. We have a different format where members can participate directly in talking with Dan and asking questions. So if that's of interest to you, please sign up today and we'll pull you in for our post sessions after the Dan Schnur Political Report. So with that, please check out our website. We have a couple of programs coming up that I'll point out to you. On April 11th, we have a live stream, the Ukrainian people's fight for freedom, past, present, future. And then again, Dan will be hosting another of our LA mayoral series with candidate Karen Bass. This is on May 17th at the beautiful Abell campus in the Mid-Wilshire district. So that's an evening event at the Abell, May 17th. Dan's our moderator, so we hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate all your support and your viewership.
Thanks so much.